Talk to yourself like this every day for 21 days, and something inside you will slowly begin to shift. Not overnight, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a quiet, powerful way that changes how you think, how you act, and how you see your life. Most people don't realize how much damage they do to themselves with their own inner voice. Every day, without noticing, they repeat thoughts like, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. It's too late for me. Or nothing ever works out. And over time, those thoughts don't stay as thoughts. They become beliefs, and those beliefs become the limits of their life. But imagine if you replace that voice. Imagine if, instead of tearing yourself down, you started building yourself up. Not with fake confidence, not with empty motivation, but with deliberate, consistent self-talk that trains your mind to work for you instead of against you. Start your day by telling yourself, I'm capable of handling whatever comes today. I may not know everything, but I can learn. I may not be perfect, but I'm improving every day. My past does not control my future. At first, it might feel unnatural. Your mind might resist it. That's normal. Because your brain is used to the old patterns, the negative shortcuts, the easy way of thinking that expects failure before effort. But you don't change your life by staying comfortable in your thoughts. You change it by repeating new thoughts until they become your new normal. When you face something difficult, don't say, I can't do this. Instead, say, this is difficult, but I can take it step by step. That small shift matters more than you think, because your brain listens to the language you use. If you speak like a defeated person, you will act like one. If you speak like someone who is learning, growing, and adapting, your actions will follow that identity. There will be moments in these 21 days when you feel like nothing is changing. You will question whether this is even working. That is exactly where most people stop. But real transformation happens in that silent phase, when it looks like nothing is happening, but everything inside is being rewired. Tell yourself every day, I do not need to have everything figured out today. I just need to move forward. I trust the process of my growth, even when I cannot see the results yet. Discipline is more powerful than motivation, and I choose discipline. Speak to yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. If a friend was struggling, you wouldn't insult them or discourage them. You would guide them, support them, remind them of their strength. So why do you speak to yourself differently? Every time you catch yourself thinking negatively, don't just ignore it. Replace it immediately. Not tomorrow, not later, but in that exact moment, say, that thought does not define me. Now I choose a better thought. I choose progress over limitation. Say things like, I am becoming more focused every day. I am learning how to stay calm under pressure. I am building a stronger mind. I do not quit when things get hard, or I adapt. And when you fail, you will fail at something during these 21 days. Do not turn it into a story of defeat. Instead, tell yourself, this is feedback, not failure. I am still in the process of becoming stronger. One mistake does not erase my progress. This is not about pretending life is easy. It's about training your mind to stop making life harder than it already is. Because most people don't struggle because life is impossible. They struggle because their inner dialogue is constantly working against them. For 21 days, commit to changing that dialogue. Speak with intention, think with awareness. Redirect your mind to every time it tries to pull you back into doubt, fear, or hesitation. And slowly, something will begin to shift. You will notice that you hesitate less, you recover faster from setbacks, you start taking action without overthinking as much. Not because the world changed, but because you changed how you speak to yourself inside. Tell yourself, I am not my past, I am not my mistakes. I am not my doubts. I am what I choose to become through my daily actions. And most importantly, remind yourself, I will not give up on myself. Not today, not tomorrow, not in these 21 days. Because if you truly talk to yourself like this every day, something powerful happens. Your inner voice stops being your enemy and starts becoming your strongest supporter. And once that changes, your entire life begins to follow. The way a person speaks to themselves in their mind is one of the most powerful forces shaping their entire life experience, yet it is also one of the most ignored. Every thought that repeats internally does not stay as a simple thought. It gradually becomes a belief, and those beliefs begin to silently control decisions, reactions, and expectations. When someone constantly criticizes themselves internally, even in small ways, it slowly builds a pattern of self-doubt that feels natural over time. A person may start to believe they are not capable, not smart enough, not disciplined enough, or not worthy of better outcomes, even if none of these assumptions are truly accurate. This internal narrative becomes like a background program running all day, influencing how challenges are interpreted and how opportunities are approached. If the inner voice is harsh, every mistake feels like proof of failure, and every difficulty feels like confirmation that things will not work out. But when the inner voice is supportive and encouraging, even setbacks begin to look like temporary situations rather than permanent definition. The difference between these two internal dialogues is not small. It can decide whether a person grows with confidence or stays stuck in hesitation. Speaking to oneself with encouragement does not mean ignoring reality or pretending that problems do not exist. It means changing the tone of interpretation. Instead of saying, I am not good at this, the mind can be trained to say, I am learning how to improve at this. Instead of I always mess things up, it can become I made a mistake, but I can move forward. This shift in language may seem simple, but the brain responds strongly to repetition and emotional framing. Over time, supportive self-talk reduces fear of failure because failure is no longer interpreted as identity, but as experience. This allows a person to take more action without being paralyzed by overthinking. Many people fail not because they lack ability, but because they mentally defeat themselves before even trying. The inner critic becomes louder than the opportunity itself, and so hesitation replaces action. When encouragement becomes the default internal voice, the mind starts to develop resilience. Difficult situations are no longer immediate signs of I can't do this, but rather signals that effort and patience are required. This builds emotional strength because the person is not constantly attacking themselves during moments of struggle. Instead of adding pressure through self-judgment, they provide themselves with support and direction. Over time, this reduces anxiety and increases clarity because mental energy is no longer wasted on self-blame. It becomes available for problem solving and progress. The mind begins to feel safer within itself. And that sense of internal safety is what allows confidence to grow naturally. Encouraging self-talk also reshapes identity gradually. A person who consistently tells themselves, I'm improving, I can handle challenges, and I am capable of learning begins to act in alignment with those statements. Identity is not built in one moment, it is formed through repeated internal reinforcement. Even if progress is slow, the mind starts to accept the idea of growth instead of limitation. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. One positive thought does not change a life, but repeated supportive thinking over days and weeks starts to rewire emotional responses. The same situation that once caused panic may later produce calm determination simply because the internal narrative has changed. It is also important to understand that the mind naturally tends to lean toward negativity if it is not guided. This is why conscious effort is needed to shift self-talk. Without intervention, the brain often replays past mistakes, fears, and comparisons with others. But when a person deliberately interrupts that pattern and replaces it with encouragement, they regain control over their mental environment. This control is not about perfection. Negative thoughts will still appear. The difference is in response. Instead of accepting them, they are challenged and redirected. Over time, speaking to oneself with encouragement builds trust within the self. Person begins to feel like they are on their own side rather than against themselves. This internal support becomes a foundation for courage, discipline, and persistence. Challenges do not disappear, but the inner experience of facing them changes completely. The mind becomes a place of strength rather than conflict, and that shift influences every external outcome because action always follows belief. And belief is shaped by the voice that speaks the most inside the mind. Replacing negative thoughts immediately with constructive ones is not about pretending that negativity does not exist, but about refusing to let it settle and take root in the mind. Thoughts appear automatically, often shaped by past experiences, fear, insecurity, or habit. The mind has been trained over time to react in certain ways, especially under pressure or uncertainty. Because of this, negative thoughts can feel instant and natural, almost like reflexes. A situation happens, and before any rational analysis takes place, the mind may produce doubt, fear, or self-criticism. If these thoughts are left unchecked, they begin to influence emotions, and those emotions begin to influence behavior. This is how a single unchallenged thought can quietly grow into hesitation, avoidance, or even self-sabotage. But when a person learns to interrupt this process at the level of thought itself, everything that follows begins to change. The practice of immediate replacement means becoming aware of what is being thought in real time. Instead of allowing a negative idea to continue its natural path, it is recognized and consciously redirected. For example, when the thought, "I cannot do this," arises, it is not ignored or suppressed, but actively replaced with something more accurate and empowering, such as, "I may not be able to do this yet, but I can learn how." This shift does not deny difficulty. It simply removes finality from the statement. Most negative thoughts are built on absolute language like always, a never, a can't, or impossible, which creates a sense of fixed limitation. Constructive thinking replaces those absolutes with openness, possibility, and growth. Over time, this changes how the mind interprets challenges, turning them from threats into tasks that can be approached step by step. This process requires repetition because the brain is accustomed to its old patterns. At first, negative thoughts may still appear frequently, and replacement may feel forced or unnatural, but consistency is what reshapes mental habits. Each time a negative thought is replaced, small shift occurs in the brain's wiring. The mind slowly begins to recognize that not every negative interpretation needs to be accepted as truth. Instead, it learns that there are alternative ways to view the same situation. With practice, the gap between noticing a negative thought and replacing it becomes shorter, until eventually the replacement becomes almost automatic. What once required effort begins to feel like a natural response. Constructive thoughts are not about blind optimism. They're about accuracy combined with direction. Instead of spiraling into "this is too hard," the mind learns to say, "this is difficult, but I can take it one step at a time." Instead of "I always fail," it becomes "I have failed before, but I can improve my approach." These adjustments may seem small, but they carry significant psychological impact because they preserve motivation instead of destroying it. When the mind is constantly speaking in defeat, energy drains quickly. But when it speaks in problem-solving language, energy is redirected toward action. Immediate thought replacement also builds emotional resilience. Life does not become easier simply because thinking improves, but the ability to handle difficulty becomes stronger. When setbacks occur, a trained mind does not collapse into self-judgment. It responds with adjustment. This reduces the emotional intensity of challenges. Problems are still recognized, but they no longer feel like personal identity statements. A mistake becomes an event, not a definition. A delay becomes a situation, not a permanent blockage. This distinction is crucial because it prevents temporary experiences from becoming long-term beliefs. Another important aspect of this practice is awareness. Many negative thoughts operate silently in the background without being noticed. Bringing attention to them is the first step toward change. Once awareness increases, the individual gains the ability to pause instead of react automatically. In that pause lies the power of choice. That is where transformation begins, because the mind is no longer running on autopilot. Instead, it's being guided intentionally. Over time, this creates a sense of control over internal experience. The person no longer feels like a passive receiver of thoughts, but an active participant in shaping them. As this habit strengthens, confidence begins to grow naturally. Not because problems disappear, but because the internal response to problems becomes stable and constructive. Even when situations are uncertain, the mind remains less chaotic. There is less internal conflict and more clarity. This clarity allows better decisions, more consistent action, and reduced fear of failure. Gradually, the overall mindset shifts from one of limitation to one of possibility, not through sudden change, but through repeated redirection of thought. Change in the human mind does not happen through one powerful moment of motivation or a single decision. It happens through repetition, consistency, and the steady reinforcement of new mental patterns over time. Most people underestimate how long their current way of thinking has been forming. Negative habits of thought are often built over years, sometimes even a lifetime, through repeated experiences, environment, self-talk, and emotional responses. Because of this, expecting instant transformation is unrealistic. The brain does not rewrite itself in a day. It adapts gradually based on what it is repeatedly exposed to. This is why consistency is far more important than intensity when it comes to reshaping mindset and behavior. When someone begins a new habit of positive self-talk or constructive thinking, the early phase often feels uncomfortable. The mind resists change because it prefers familiar patterns, even if those patterns are harmful. In the beginning, negative thoughts may still appear frequently, and old reactions may feel stronger than new responses. This stage can create doubt, making a person question whether anything is actually changing. However, this is exactly where transformation begins, even if it is not visible yet. Internally, small neural adjustments are taking place. Each time a person chooses a better thought over a negative one, even if it feels forced, a signal is sent to the brain that a new pathway is being formed. Repetition strengthens this pathway while old ones slowly weaken due to lack of reinforcement. Consistency works because the mind learns through patterns, not isolated actions. One positive day does not override years of negative thinking, but 21 consecutive days of intentional thought begin to shift the baseline. The brain starts to recognize new responses as normal. At first, the change may be subtle, such as recovering slightly faster from negative thoughts or noticing self-criticism more quickly than before. These small shifts are important indicators that the process is working. Many people fail to continue because they expect dramatic results too soon and assume nothing is happening. In reality, most meaningful mental change is quiet at the beginning. Daily repetition also builds identity reinforcement. When a person consistently tells themselves constructive thoughts, such as being capable of learning or improving, the mind begins to slowly integrate these ideas into self-perception. Identity is not created by a single belief, but by repeated confirmation of that belief through thought and action. Over time, what once felt like forced positivity begins to feel natural. The internal voice that once doubted everything starts to soften, replaced gradually by a more balanced and supportive tone. This does not mean negative thoughts disappear completely, but they lose their dominance. Another important aspect of consistency is emotional stability. When the mind is repeatedly guided toward constructive thinking, emotional reactions become less extreme. Situations that once triggered stress or panic begin to feel more manageable because the internal narrative is less catastrophic. Instead of immediately assuming failure or danger, the mind starts to pause and interpret situations more calmly. This stability does not come from avoiding challenges, but from repeatedly practicing a calmer response to them. Consistency also strengthens discipline, which is essential for long-term mental change. Motivation fluctuates, but discipline is built through repetition, regardless of emotional state. There will be days when positive thinking feels difficult or meaningless, yet continuing the practice on those days is what makes it effective. Each repetition during resistance is more powerful than repetition during motivation because it reinforces commitment rather than emotion. Over time, this creates mental endurance, where the person is no longer dependent on feeling motivated to think positively or take action. Gradually, what begins as an intentional practice becomes an automatic habit. The mind starts to default to more balanced interpretations of situations. Negative thoughts still arise, but they no longer dominate the entire mental space. Instead, they are quickly balanced with alternative perspectives. This shift creates a sense of mental clarity and reduces internal chaos. Life circumstances may remain the same, but the internal experience of those circumstances changes significantly. Consistency also builds trust in oneself. Every repeated effort sends a message to the mind that change is possible and that commitment is real. This self-trust becomes the foundation for confidence. When a person knows they can consistently follow through on their internal commitments, they begin to believe in their ability to handle external challenges as well. This belief is not built overnight. It is constructed through continuous small actions that accumulate over time. Eventually, the mind reaches a point where new thinking patterns feel more natural than old ones. What once required effort becomes automatic response. This transformation is not dramatic, but it is deep and lasting. It is the result of showing up every day, even when progress is not obvious, and allowing repetition to slowly reshape the inner world. Doubt appears in every mind, regardless of strength, success, or experience, because doubt is a natural reaction of the brain when it encounters uncertainty or pressure. It is not a sign of weakness. It is simply a mental signal that the mind is trying to protect itself from possible failure or discomfort. The problem is not the presence of doubt, but the acceptance of doubt. The mind no longer collapses at the first sign of uncertainty. It engages with it. Instead of withdrawing, it investigates. Instead of assuming failure, it considers alternatives. This shift does not eliminate challenges, but it changes the relationship. The mind becomes less reactive to setbacks because it understands their role in development. Instead of collapsing after a mistake, the individual stabilizes more quickly and returns to action. This recovery speed is one of the most important indicators of mental strength. It does not mean the person feels nothing. It means they do not stay stuck in emotional interpretation for long periods. They process, learn, adjust, and move forward. Separating identity from outcomes is a critical part of this transformation. Identity is who a person is consistently over time, while outcomes are temporary results influenced by many variables such as preparation, timing, environment, and external condition. Confusing the two leads to distorted self-perception. A single poor performance does not define capability, just as a single success does not define mastery. When this understanding becomes clear, emotional balance improves significantly. The mind stops swinging between extremes of confidence, self-doubt based on isolated events. This perspective also encourages persistence. When failure is personalized, people tend to quit to protect their self-image. When failure is depersonalized and seen as information, persistence becomes easier because there is no identity threat involved. Each attempt is simply another step in refining the approach. This creates long-term consistency, which is essential for achieving meaningful results in any area of life. Eventually, repeated practice of viewing failure reshapes the internal narrative. Instead of saying, "I failed, so I'm not capable," the mind begins to say, "This method did not work, so I need to adjust." Instead of interpreting setbacks as final outcomes, they are understood as part of a larger process. This change reduces emotional burden, increases clarity, and strengthens confidence rooted in experience rather than assumption. Over time, failure loses its power to define and gains its true purpose, to guide improvement and support continuous growth. The way a person speaks to themselves internally becomes the foundation upon which their entire mindset, behavior, and life direction are built, even though most people rarely pay attention to it. This inner dialogue is constant, shaping interpretations of events, influencing emotional responses, and guiding decisions in subtle but powerful ways. Every thought that repeats in the mind contributes to a larger internal narrative, and over time, that narrative becomes the framework through which reality is experienced. If the internal voice is harsh, critical, and limiting, life begins to feel heavy, uncertain, and restricted. If the internal voice is supportive, constructive, and growth-oriented, life begins to feel more manageable even in the presence of difficulty. The external world may remain unchanged, but the internal interpretation of it shifts completely. And that shift determines how a person moves through challenges, opportunities, and setbacks. Words spoken internally are not just reflections of mood. They are instructions that the brain begins to follow. When a person repeatedly tells themselves that they are not capable, the mind starts to reduce effort, avoid risk, and look for evidence that confirms their belief. When a person consistently reinforces that they are learning, improving, and capable of adapting, the mind begins to search for solutions, take initiative, and persist longer under pressure. This happens because the brain is constantly trying to align behavior with the dominant internal narrative. It does not distinguish between helpful and unhelpful beliefs in the moment. It simply reinforces what is repeated most often. This is why self-talk is directly connected to discipline. Discipline is not only about forcing action. It is about the internal conversation that precedes action. If the inner voice constantly discourages effort with thoughts like it's too hard, you will fail anyway, or there's no point, then discipline weakens because motivation is continuously undermined. But when the internal voice supports action with thoughts like a just start, a take it step by step, or you can handle discomfort, discipline becomes easier to maintain because the mind is not fighting against itself. Instead of resistance, there is alignment between intention and thought. Confidence is also deeply shaped by self-talk. Confidence is not simply the absence of fear. It is the presence of supportive internal reinforcement that allows action despite fear. When a person speaks to themselves with encouragement, even in uncertain situations, they develop a sense of internal stability. They begin to trust their ability to respond rather than rely on certainty. This trust does not come from external validation, but from repeated internal reinforcement that they can handle challenges, learn from mistakes, and continue moving forward. Over time, this builds a steady form of confidence that is not easily shaken by temporary setbacks. The quality of self-talk also determines emotional resilience. Life inevitably includes stress, pressure, and unexpected problems, but the internal voice decides how those experiences are processed. A destructive inner voice amplifies stress by adding judgment and criticism on top of the situation. A constructive inner voice reduces emotional overload by focusing on solutions, progress, and control over what can be changed. This difference affects how quickly a person recovers from difficulty. With supportive self-talk, emotional recovery becomes faster because the mind is not trapped in self-blame or exaggeration of the problem. Over time, the repetition of positive and constructive self-talk leads to identity reinforcement. A person does not become confident, disciplined, or resilient in a single moment. They become those things through repeated internal confirmation. Every time they choose to speak to themselves with respect instead of criticism, they strengthen a mental pattern that aligns with growth. Gradually, this pattern becomes automatic, and the internal voice that once doubted everything begins to shift towards support and guidance. This transformation does not mean negative thoughts disappear completely, because the mind naturally produces a range of thoughts. However, what changes is the dominance of those thoughts. Instead of being controlled by negative internal dialogue, the individual learns to guide it. They begin to recognize that thoughts are not commands, but mental events that can be observed, evaluated, and reshaped. This awareness creates space between thought and reaction, allowing choice instead of automatic response. Eventually, consistent supportive self-talk becomes a defining force in how a person lives. It influences how they approach goals, handle setbacks, and interpret their own potential. The external circumstances of life may vary, but the internal voice becomes a stable source of direction and encouragement. And when that internal voice becomes aligned with growth rather than limitation, it reshapes not just thinking, but the entire trajectory of behavior and outcomes over time. Over time, consistent supportive self-talk becomes more than just a mental exercise. It turns into a stable way of living and responding to life. The inner voice gradually shifts from criticism to guidance, from doubt to direction, and from limitation to possibility. As this transformation deepens, a person begins to feel less controlled by sudden thoughts and more grounded in their ability to choose how they respond. Challenges still appear, but they no longer feel overwhelming in the same way because the internal dialogue provides structure and reassurance instead of pressure and negativity. This steady inner support builds emotional balance, allowing the mind to recover faster from staying focused on solutions rather than problems. Slowly, confidence becomes less about external validation and more about internal trust, and discipline becomes easier because the mind is no longer working against itself. In this way, the quality of self-talk shapes not only thoughts, but also actions, habits, and long-term direction, ultimately influencing how a person experiences their life as a whole.